Hello viewers, today I would like you to acquaint you with the topic Marginalization Concept and Types. Introduction. What is marginalization? Marginalization is a slippery and a multi-layered concept. Whole societies can be marginalized at the global level, while classes and communities can be marginalized from the dominant social order. Similarly, ethnic groups, families or individuals can be marginalized within localities. To a certain extent, marginalization is a shifting phenomena linked to social status. For example, individuals or groups might enjoy high social status at one point in time, but as social change takes place, so they lose their status and become marginalized. At certain stages of the life cycle, the risk of marginalization increases or decreases. For example, the marginalized status of children and youth may decrease as they get older. The marginalized status of adults may increase as they become elders. The marginalized status of single mothers may change as their children grow up, and so on. Even so, there are different risks within particular social groups at risk of marginalization. Elder and Noor 1998, for example, demonstrate that the risks of marginalization of immigrant youth in Europe may vary with ethnicity, irrespective of the particular host countries or of degree of acculturation. Kagan and Scott Roberts in 2002, working with the NGOs supporting families in the slums of Kolkata, illustrate how having a disabled child further marginalizes them. Similarly, Wenzel, Koigel and Gelberg in 2000 draw our attention to the different risks faced by homeless women compared to homeless men. Dimensions of marginalization. Poverty and economic marginality. People who are experiencing marginalization are likely to have tenuous involvement in the economy. The sources of their income will vary. Some will be waged and some will depend upon state benefits. Marginal economic activity such as casual work or charity. It is not unusual for people to combine or move between these various ways of getting money in their struggle for survival. Poverty, dependency and feelings of shame are everyday aspects of economic dislocation and social marginalization. Impaired support networks and social marginalization. A further problem is the relative or complete exclusion of the marginalized people from these social networks. People born into marginality will be, at best, able to access resources through strong social networks. For example, a person born with impairments but into a rich family. Others will be able to access weaker networks such as neighborhood, but often these sources of support will be weak or overburdened. For example, in some poor communities where unemployment is a norm and the social problems are rife, tenants association have retreated to a minimal role of working just in the interests of those on the committee. Isolated from the world of work, strong associations like trade unions are not available to economically marginalized people. People who have become disabled and those with a severely disabled child often report rejection and isolation from their former friends and allies. Marginalization then means a reduced opportunity to link with others in common action to solve problems. The result can be described as disempowerment. Ideological aspects of marginalization. The above two dimensions of marginalization, poverty and economic dislocation and disempowerment or social dislocation, can be regarded as primary material insults. But being a member of a marginalized group also brings the risk of some more psychological, ideological threats. The first of these is the definition of one's identity by others. The ideological definition of one's marginalized identity in the interest of the dominant groups in society. There have been many examples of this, and so far as we know, without exception, all the social movements representing oppressed and marginalized groups have pinpointed and offered critiques of this particular phenomena. What typically seems to happen is that the situation of the marginalized persons is portrayed as a result of their own characteristics. What is essentially a social and historical phenomena is presented as a biological or an intrapsychic phenomena. The problems that people face are then seen as their own making, or at least as inseparable from their particular nature. The phenomena is naturalized, seen not only as socially determined reality, but as something to be expected given the way the person is. This phenomena has been called blaming the victim by Ryan in 1976, which is a part of a more general culture of blame, which is given by Farber and Azar in 1999. Examples of this should be familiar and will be encountered in the following lecture in relation to the particular oppressed groups. Psychology has often colluded with ideologies that blame the victim by offering endogenous causes of the situation in which oppressed people find themselves. These causes have reflected the scientific and psychological theory of the time. From McDougall's use of instinct at the turn of the last century, through drives and personality traits, to the maladaptive cognitive structures that today's cognitive theorists claim to detect. The latter have some justification because oppressed people internalize aspects of the existing social reality and its ideological story. Some psychological writers have offered analysis of what goes on in process of internalization. Martin Barrow studied the phenomena of fatalism in Latin American societies. Psychological explanations had considered this in terms of the character of the people concerned. It had been suggested that these personality characteristics develop in a specific cultural context, for example, a culture of poverty, in which destitution leads to cultural patterns that are passed on and are no longer adaptive. Martin Barrow suggests other explanations. The first of these is fatalism's truth. The impossibility of social change, poverty, debt, failed social movements leads to an internalization of external reality. As a result, we see a correlation between the societal context and the psychological structures. The oppressed classes assume that their destiny is out of their control. The structure condemns to failure whatever members of the poor classes do to get ahead. Secondly, he looks at fatalism as the internalization of social domination. Martin Barrow follows Fanon, who suggested that violence imposed by the colonizer is introjected, turned inward by the colonized. It remains anchored in their musculature as repressed tension and in their minds as guilt. Similarly, for Freire, the oppressed are immersed in the condition in which they are robbed and rendered helpless. Unable to get the source of their condition, They take refuge in a fatalistic attitude, transforming history into nature. The oppressor becomes an irresistible model for the oppressed, with whom they identify and whose orders they follow. Resistance and resilience. Despite all the negative impositions of ideology, the situation of the oppressed people is also characterized by resistance and resilience. In resilience, there is the potential for an enhanced, reclaimed, and reinvented identity. The very fact of being oppressed, of having fundamental rights denied or diminished, elicits attempts to remediate the situation. This can be negative and destructive, as in the vandalism and petty crime of disaffected youth in our cities, or in pathologies of self-destruction, addiction, and depression. However, attempts at remediation can also be highly positive, as in collective action to improve the social arrangements. The relevance of community psychology to marginalization community psychology should be particularly well placed to help people respond to challenge of their marginalization in constructive ways. Its refusal to restrict itself to the individual level and to attribute social problems to pathology carried by the victims is a first step. In addition, it can critically utilize concepts from the psychology of individuals to understand the processes that penetrate and dominate these marginalized people. Types of marginalization. First, individual exclusion. The marginal man is one whom fate has condemned to live in two societies and in two not merely different but antagonistic cultures. His mind is the crucible in which two different and refractory cultures may be said to melt and either wholly or in part fuse. Social exclusion at the individual level results in an individual's exclusion from the meaningful participation in the society. An example is the exclusion of a single mother's from welfare system prior to the welfare reforms of 1900s. The modern welfare system is based on the concept of entitlement to the basic means of being a productive member of the society, both as an organic function of society and as compensation for the socially useful labor provided. A single mother's contribution to society is not based on formal employment, but on the notion that provision of welfare for children is a necessary social expense. In some career contexts, caring work is devalued and motherhood is seen as a barrier to employment. Single mothers were previously marginalized in spite of their significant role in the socializing of children due to views that an individual can only contribute meaningfully to that society through gainful employment. More broadly, many women face social exclusion. Musa Mitha discusses the Western feminist movement as a direct reaction to the marginalization of white women in society. Women are excluded from the labor force and their work in the home was not valued. Feminists argue that men and women should equally participate in the labor force, in the public and the private sector and in the home. They also focused on labor laws to increase the access to employment as well as to recognize child rearing as a valuable form of labor. In some places today, women are still marginalized from executive positions and continue to earn less than men in upper management positions. Another example of individual marginalization is the exclusion of individuals with disabilities from the labor force. Grants discusses an employer's viewpoint about hiring individuals living with disabilities and jeopardizing the productivity, increasing the rate of absenteeism, and creating more accidents in the workplace. Cantor also discusses employer concern about the excessively high cost of accommodating people with disability. The marginalization of individuals with disabilities is prevalent today. Despite the legislation intended to prevent it in the most Western countries and the academic achievements, skills and training of many disabled people. Therefore, isolation is common to almost every vocational, religious or cultural group of a large city. Each develops its own sentiments, attitudes, codes, even its own words, which are the best only partially to others. Second, community exclusion. Many communities experience social exclusion, such as racial, for example black, for example untouchables or low caste, or Dalit in Indian caste system, and economic, for example Romani communities. One example is the Aboriginal community in Australia. Marginalization of Aboriginal communities is a product of colonization. As a result of colonization, Aboriginal communities lost their land, were forced into destitute areas, lost their source of livelihood, and were excluded from the labour market. Additionally, Aboriginal communities lost their culture and values through forced assimilation and lost their rights in the society. Today, whereas Aboriginal communities continue to be marginalized from society due to the development of practices, policies and programs that met the need of white people and not the needs of the marginalized groups themselves. Yi also connects marginalization to minority communities when describing the concept of whiteness as maintaining and enforcing dominant norms and discourse. Poor people living in rundown council estates and areas with high crime can be locked into social deprivation. Third, professional exclusion. Some intellectuals and thinkers are marginalized because of their dissenting, radical or controversial views on the range of topics including HIV/AIDS, climate change, evolution, alternative medicine, green energy or third world politics. Though fashionable for a time to some, they are more widely regarded as intellectual freethinkers whose ideas and views run against those of the mainstream. At times, they are marginalized and abused, often systematically orchestrated by their colleagues, and in some cases their work ridiculed or banned from publication. For example, these include Peter Duisberg, Suzanne George, Martin Fleischmann, Stanley Pons, E.F. Schumacher. The major contributors of marginalization. Major contributors include race, income, employment status, social class, geographical location, personal habits and appearance, education, religion and political affiliation. First, global and structural globalization. Immigration, social welfare and policy are broader social structures that have the potential to contribute negatively to one's access to resources and services, resulting in the social exclusion of individuals and groups. Similarly, increasing use of information technology and company outsourcing have contributed to the job insecurity and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Alphonse, George and Moffat in 2007 discuss how globalization sets forth a decrease in the role of the state with an increase in support from various corporate sectors, resulting in gross inequalities, injustice and marginalization of various vulnerable groups. Companies are outsourcing, jobs are lost, the cost of living continues to rise, and land is being expropriated by large companies. Material goods are made in large abundance and sold at cheaper costs, While in India, for example, the poverty line is lowered in order to mask the number of individuals who are actually living in poverty as a result of globalization. Globalization and structural forces aggravate poverty and continue to push individuals to the margins of society, while governments and large corporations do not address the issue. Certain language and the meaning attached to language can cause universalizing discourses that are influenced by the Western world, which is what Sue Paul in 2006 describes as the potential to dilute or even annihilate local cultures and traditions to deny context-specific realities. What Sue Paul is implying is that the effect of the dominant global discourses can cause individuals or cultural displacement, as well as an experience of delocalization. As individual notions of security and safety are jeopardized. Insecurity and fear of an unknown future and the instability can result in displacement, exclusion, and forced assimilation into the dominant group. For many, it further pushes them to the margins of society or enlists new members to the outskirts because of global capitalism or dominant discourses. With the prevailing notion of globalization, we now see the rise of immigration as the world gets smaller and smaller, with millions of individuals relocating each other. This is not without hardship and struggle of what a newcomer thought was going to be, a new life with new opportunities. Ferguson, Levelet and Whitmore in 2005 discussed how immigration has had a strong link to access of welfare support programs. Newcomers are constantly bombarded with instability to access the country's resource because they are seen as undeserving foreigners. With this comes a denial of access to public housing, healthcare benefits, employment support services and social security benefits, given by Ferguson et al. In 2005. Newcomers are seen as undeserving, or that they must prove their entitlement in order to gain access to basic support necessities. It is clear that individuals are exploited and marginalized within the country they have immigrated. Welfare states and social policies can also exclude individuals from basic necessities and support programs. Welfare payments were proposed to assist individuals in accessing a small amount of material wealth. Young in 2000 further discusses how the provision of the welfare itself produces new injustice by depriving those dependent on it of rights and freedoms that others have. Marginalization is unjust because it blocks the opportunity to exercise capacity in socially defined and a recognized way. This is the notion that by providing a minimal amount of welfare support, and an individual will be free from marginalization. In fact, welfare support programs further lead to injustices by restricting certain behavior as well as the individual is mandated to other agencies. The individual is forced into a new system of rules while facing social stigma and stereotypes from the dominant group in society, further marginalizing and excluding these individuals, given by Young in 2000. Thus, social policy and welfare provisions reflect the dominant notions in society by constructing and reinforcing categories of people and their needs. It ignores the unique subjective human essence, further continuing the cycle of dominance, given by Wilson and Beresford in 2000. Second is unemployment. While recognizing the multidimensionality of exclusion, Policy work undertaken at European Union level focuses on unemployment as a key cause of, or at least correlating with, social exclusion. This is because in modern societies, paid work is not only the principal source of income with which to buy services, but it also is the fount of individuals' identity and a feeling of self-worth. Most people's social networks and sense of embeddedness in society also revolve around their work. Many of the indicators of extreme social exclusion, such as poverty and homelessness, depend on monetary income, which is normally derived from work. Social exclusion can be a possible result of long-term unemployment, especially in countries with weak welfare safety nets. Much policy to reduce exclusion thus focuses on the labour market. On the one hand, to make individuals at risk of exclusion more attractive to employers, that is, more employable. On the other hand, to encourage employers to be more inclusive in their employment policies. The European Union's Equal Community initiative investigated ways to increase the inclusiveness of the labour market. Work on social exclusion more broadly is carried out through the Open Method of Coordination (OMC) among the member state governments. Third, religion. Some religious traditions recommend excommunication of individuals said to deviate from a religious teaching, and in some instances shunning by family members. Such religious organizations permit the censure of critics. Across studies, individuals and communities can be socially excluded on the basis of their religious beliefs. Social hostility against religious minorities and communal violence occurs in areas where governments do not have policies restricting the religious practice of minorities. A study by the Pew Research Center on International Religious Freedom found that 61% of countries have social hostilities that tend to target religious minorities. The 5 highest social hostilities scores were for Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Iraq and Bangladesh. In 2015, Pew published that social hostilities declined in 2013, but harassment of Jews increased. Consequences of marginalization and ways to reduce it. First, crime. Sociologists see strong links between crime and marginalization in industrialized society such as the United States. Growing crime rates may reflect the fact that a growing number of people do not feel valued in the society in which they live. The excluded population are in favor of illegal means of fulfilling their goals and motives in life, as they have no other way to fit into the society that will not accept them. Crime is favored over the political system or community organization. Young people increasingly grow up without guidance and support from the adult population. Young people also face diminishing job opportunities to sustain a livelihood. This can cause a sense of willingness to turn to illegitimate means of sustaining a desired lifestyle. Second, in philosophy, the marginal, the processes of marginalization, etc., bring specific interest in postmodern and post-colonial philosophy and social studies. Postmodernization questions the center about its authenticity, and postmodern sociology and cultural studies research marginal cultures, behaviors, societies, the situation of marginalized individuals, etc. Implications for the social work practice. Upon defining and describing marginalization as well as the various levels in which it exists, one must explore its implications for social work practice. Mulale describes how the personal is political and the need for recognizing that social problems are indeed connected with larger structures in society, causing various forms of oppression amongst the individuals, resulting in marginalization. It is also important for a social worker to recognize the intersecting nature of oppression. A non-judgmental and unbiased attitude is necessary on the part of a social worker. The worker must begin to understand oppression and marginalization as a systematic problem, not the fault of the individual itself. Working under an anti-oppression perspective would then allow the social worker to understand the lived subjective experiences of the individuals as well as their cultural, historical and social background. The worker should recognize the individual as political in the process of becoming a valuable member of the society and the structural factors that contribute to oppression and marginalization, given by Mulale in 2007. Social workers must take a firm stance on naming and labeling global forces that impact individuals and communities who are then left with no support, leading to marginalization or further marginalization from the society they once knew. The social worker should be constantly reflexive, work to raise the consciousness, empower and understand the lived subjective realities of individuals living in a fast-paced world, where fear and insecurity constantly subjugate the individual from the collective whole, perpetuating the dominant forces while silencing the oppressed. Some individuals and groups who are not professional social workers build relationships with marginalized people by providing relational care and support, for example through homeless ministry. These relationships validate the individuals who are marginalized and provide them a meaningful contact with the mainstream. Fourth, juridical concept. The Vienna Declaration and Programme of Action, a document on international human rights instruments, affirms that extreme poverty and social exclusion constitute a violation of human dignity and that urgent steps are necessary to achieve better knowledge of extreme poverty and its causes, including those related to the program of development, in order to promote the human rights of the poorest and to put an end to extreme poverty and social exclusion and promote the enjoyment of the fruits of social progress. It is essential for states to foster participation by poorest people in the decision-making process by the community in which they live. The promotion of human rights and efforts to combat extreme poverty. Conclusion: marginalization is the process whereby something or someone is pushed to the edge of a group and accorded lesser importance, which is predominantly a social phenomena by which a minority or subgroup is excluded and their needs or desired ignored. Therefore, the government should put more efforts in bringing the people to the mainstream by providing all the social, economic, cultural, psychological amenities and enhancing the self-esteem of the marginalized people by fulfilling their needs. I sincerely hope this lecture proves to be informative and enlightening for all the viewers. Thank you.